Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thanks again for making it to Thursday. And I can say for myself, it's been such a rewarding discussion already. As a matter of fact, I'll apologize in advance about how full my head is after this week of discussion. But I hope to keep my talk as clear as possible, and then we can discuss as we go along. The title clearly indicates, I can unpack it a little. It's not up there. It's not supposed to be. But it's not supposed to be. But basically, my entire dissertation is focused on the practice of what I'm calling Islamic almsgiving in India. And this, of course, primarily refers to zakat, but also includes khums, which you could take as either parallel, khums among Shia, or we could take as parallel, or perhaps encompassed by the notion of zakat, and then sadaqah in the sense that it's often impossible to distinguish through observation what is sadaqah and what is zakat, because it depends on the intention or the niyat of the giver. And it's a dissertation in anthropology, so I'm going to bracket the social theory that I sometimes bring in, Foucault, Weber, Michael Sandel, who would like to ask about that? Kamal did. And try and keep my discussion focused on what, as Ermin suggested, I think the group here finds most relevant, the questions of ethics and the law in particular. And in this paper, and as one of the major themes of my work in general, I would like to invite the group to reconsider the practice of zakat as according to some categorizations, which I call the purity ethic and the developmentalist ethic. These are my own terms, but they do arise from observations during my fieldwork and my own both observations reading in fiqh with madrasa students and instructors, and also observations of ordinary Muslims' practices related to zakat and charity. And my argument for this group is I particularly would like to discuss how what I'm calling the purity ethic and the developmentalist ethic represent a bit of historical change in applied ethics, which is in the title of my talk. So when ordinary Muslims in practice and daily life seek to implement the Sharia in their life and follow the guidance of lemmas offered by fiqh, how do these guidelines become applied in different ways in different historical times, in ways that seem to be changes in the tradition? And specifically, I'm speaking of a change from what I'm calling a purity ethic to developmentalist ethic in India. Let me skip ahead. I need to get into the meat here. Why am I saying purity ethic and developmentalist ethic? It's perhaps an oversimplification, but a useful one to say that, well, first of all, as Jonathan Brown mentioned, and a concept I find useful, imagining Islamic law or the Sharia or even the bodies of fiqh that we have as diverse, as very internally variegated. I think you said a grab bag, Mr. Potato Head, whatever your metaphor. I find very useful, and not only is that useful, it's also in direct contrast to the way that many ordinary Muslims that I spoke with in India speak of Islamic law or the Sharia in the singular or as divine command. We sometimes translate Islamic law, which is of course in the singular, and even if you translate it more precisely as the path or the way, this still often ends up in the singular and conceals some of the ways in which I hope my data will show there's actually a recognition of a lot of diversity. So I'm sorry, it's perhaps a useful oversimplification, but the purity ethic I'm calling the general focus of moral criteria on the spiritual well-being and the modesty of the giver of zakat. So we all know zakat means purification, and there's a set of moral concerns related to how the donor is purified and the donor's wealth is purified through the giving of zakat. And a developmentalist ethic, or the concerns that comprise that, I observed as being focused on the material well-being of the recipients. So how they utilize those zakat gifts, what they do with it, and how they use them in their own lives. A little background. Actually, it's great to be presenting alongside someone from Indonesia because I gave a lecture last at the George Mason Center for Global Islamic Studies, and there's more recognition in the American Academy that Islam is in fact global, and the biggest Muslim countries in the world are Indonesia, Pakistan, and India, in that order. There's even some speculation that there's more Indian Muslims than there are Pakistani Muslims. It's within like a couple tens of million, which is nothing for the subcontinent. So I hope that that this sorts of data only comes into these conversations more often. And then secondly, there's more focus within Muslim societies in recent decades and century on Islamic charity and zakat as a ritual practice, and according to my observations, this practice is growing. There's a recent study by the Pew Research Center in one of their global surveys found that more Muslims reported giving zakat than reported performing salat. So it was like 77% gave zakat and 63% reported doing daily prayers. I collected my own data on Islamic charities in the North Indian city of Lucknow and found that each of the 6 charities I worked with were all founded since 1990, except for one that was founded in 1970s as the sort of an exception. And each year that I was able to see the data, their budgets and were growing. And then a main part of their fundraising strategy is, of course, collecting zakat. So this is by way of saying everybody likes to talk about zakat as the fallen pillar of Islam. There's of the 5 arkan, it's the one that's potentially being ignored. And so for this group, if somebody says that to you, maybe think about, is that what's in the data? Is that what's actually happening? Or is it a fundraising appeal? Because as we know, everybody's giving their zakat often in secret, and making you feel guilty that zakat is not being given is sometimes effective. And then even if it is a fundraising appeal, then of course our response should be, Alhamdulillah, please take my sadaqah. This is a wonderful opportunity. God has sent the beggar to your door as a chance to do good, as the hadith says. So keep that in mind. A quick note on methodology also. I am coming from anthropology, so I did ethnographic fieldwork about 18 months in the city of Lucknow, India in 2012 and 2013. This is case study data, right? So that's in the title. This is not generalizable. I'm reporting observations from certain communities and in one city in one country. The methodology of participant observation in particular that I used involved spending time living the daily lives of specifically Urdu literate Muslims. And in my case, anthropologists always say they chose a tribe and they lived there. And so by way of specifying my unit of analysis, you could say that I was working with reformist Muslim givers. Most Muslims in Lucknow are very aware of what's been called the Islamic revival and the types of discourses coming out of Deoband and Nadwa and the colonial era reformist madrasas. And in many ways, I imagine my methodology is reading fiqh and alongside some of the people that are familiar with these reformist discourses and the scriptures that they're referring to. So to start out with a vignette, one of the charities that I worked with, the Society for Divine Welfare, or in Urdu, Anjuman Falah Idare, in Old Lucknow, had a regular charity distribution event. It happened about 4 times a year, and after this charity had been collecting zakat and charity from a whole number of donors in the neighborhood, they would give it out in one event that happened to be public. And so, despite this other hadith that I heard repeated very often in Lucknow, India, give from your right hand so the left hand will not know, recorded in the Sahih al-Bukhari. This distribution event, like I said, there were invitations went out and there was an audience. So one particular midsummer day last July, I sat with about a dozen zakat donors in a mosque in one of the bazaar back streets of the bazaar in Old City, Lucknow, and observing these charity distributions that were not so secret. There was clearly an instance of the left hand not being able to hide what was being given by the right. What happened is that the head of the charity, Maulana Jahangir Qasmi, who was educated at Deoband, had collected a number of items that he had purchased with the zakat donations, such as sewing machines, rickshaws, street vendor carts for selling vegetables, and the needy Muslims who had in the area who had filled out application forms and been pre-vetted to attend this event were sitting in the audience, and he took their names and read them one by one. Abdul Hakim, please come up, and then one of the donors would pass out this vegetable cart or this sewing machine for the women. The donors themselves sometimes were the ones that handed out the items, sort of as a mark of recognition. Sometimes the donors and the recipient's photograph was even taken as sort of a record that this transaction had taken place. And then the next day I saw the distribution event in the local Urdu newspaper. This Maulana is able to get journalists to cover his events, not mentioning names. I should be specific. He doesn't mention names. He doesn't publish photographs of the recipients in the paper. They exist on his file somewhere, but the fact that this zakat distribution happened was part of the local news. And during the time I was there, this sort of elderly preacher's son, who barely ever used a computer, the preacher himself had never used a computer, but the son created a Facebook page for his father. This charity is now online. I'm following the news feed myself, basically giving a global expanded audience for this type of zakat activity. So this zakat is far from secret. What's going on here? It's a far cry from the hadith that Prophet Muhammad, speaking of the left hand not knowing what the right hand is giving. And a lot of my analysis is focused on discovering what the rationale is for this type of institutionalized zakat giving, which you can actually see all over the world. This is very similar to what the largest charities that we're familiar with are doing in the UK, Islamic Relief, in terms of monitoring recipients, asking for applications, keeping meticulous records of the zakat that is collected and distributed, even records of donors, for example, and recognizing who the donors are in some cases. But what the natural explanation would seem to me in many people's minds is, zakat associations are clearly mimicking Western NGOs. This has been happening for a long time in America and Europe. These modern bureaucratized practices are common and necessary in the modern world if you want to be fundraising in places like the West and among Muslims in the West, or in India where people have been influenced by this type of idea. But I'd like to suggest an alternative interpretation that this Maulana and others like him with charity organizations are actually applying what is a diversity of concerns in the Sharia in different ways. So what I call the purity ethic, you could say, arose from my interviews with zakat givers who aren't part of these organizations. So neighbors, family members, and otherwise ordinary Muslims who weren't involved with organized charities. And also arose from my discussions with madrasa students and my own reading along with madrasa students of what is taught as sort of the basics of zakat, if you will. So I dwell on this in my other writing, but I won't for this crowd. But everybody knows zakat is obligated upon Muslims. It's the third of the 5 pillars, the arkan. This obligation is quite clear. The requirement to give charity is mentioned dozens of times in the Quran, often right next to salat. Establish salat and give zakat. And then in the case of the Jafri madhab, the rate for obligatory alms is specified in the Quran, meaning the rate for khums is specified at 1/5 in a verse of the Quran related to ghanimat that actually came up in Osama's paper. And for Sunni, the rate is also specified in hadith, on silver, 1/4 of 1/10 is due, so 1/40th of silver is due, or 2.5%. So my point being that this obligation is well established in Scripture. So one key criterion of the purity ethic is this obligatoriness. The second key theme in what I call the purity ethic is the idea of purification itself. Purification of who? Purification of the donor. So the spotlight here is quite on the donor. Imam Shafi'i wrote extensively, actually, on the resemblance of zakat to wudu, as one is bodily purification, the other is financial purification. And I already mentioned the zakat means purification, and even the verse that is taken to most clearly represent the injunction to give zakat that came down in the year after Hijrah 9, for the Prophet Muhammad to collect charity from Muslims. So basically not only asking Muslims to give charity, but empowering the Prophet to take it, which is often cited as the verse that makes zakat into, in some interpretations, the world's first social welfare system, in other interpretations, the root of the justification for an Islamic state, which is able to self-finance itself, sort of as an alms tax. I'm speaking about the Quranic verse. I just had it at 103. And so the verb there, even though the word for charity, as in take charity, is sadaqah, the verb is tuzakim. So coming from the same root word as zakat, to purify them by taking charity. And then, of course, the natural response, especially from this crowd, is going to be, well, zakat is purification in the sense of ibadat, but in this, when it comes alongside the other ibadat, but it also appears in the madrasa curriculum as mu'amalat, so in different books spoken of in a different way. And Wael Halak writes about this too. Zakat, according to Wael Halak, I think he says it's unique, perhaps even like one of the few or only practices that's like that appears both as ibadat and as mu'amalat. But why I'm returning to this theme of purification as such a strong theme is when I sat through classes in the madrasa Darul Uloom Nadwat Ulama, and the way the primers are structured that these classes and lectures are based on. I have a quote in my paper that the muftis and the instructors were constantly reminding us that although zakat has a financial dimension as mu'amalat, and you're transacting with another person, the most important part is ibadat. And I heard this repeated a number of times, that the obligation on the donor is more important than the transactional aspect, or at least if you focus too much on the transactional aspect, you're losing the point. What was the gist of the classes? And then thirdly, after the themes of obligation and purification in the purity ethic, is this idea of secrecy, which I opened up with. So there's the popular hadith, giving from your right hand so your left doesn't know. And then there's at least two verses in the Quran. So the idea that acts of charity and goodwill are invalidated by reminders of generosity or injury, often interpreted as if you follow up with the people that you've been generous to, this is somehow immodest, and reminding them that you're a wealthy person, that maybe they owe you. And this is explicitly condemned in the Surah Al-Baqarah 264. And another verse, interestingly, is more specific, saying if you disclose acts of charity, even as well, but if you conceal them and makes them reach those that are most in need, then it's best for you. and Al-Ghazali has an extensive meditation on this in the Ihya, and interestingly, the Tablighi Jamaat picks up in India, the preaching society in India picks up on that theme about giving your charity as secretly as possible, and that this in the main manual of the Tablighi Jamaat, the Faza'il Amal, in the section on Sadaqah, he goes on, Maulana Zakaria goes on for about 8 pages about the importance of being modest and giving zakat and everything you do. Suffice to say, it's an important teaching. And I'd like to suggest that the combination of these 3 elements, the obligation upon the donor and the purification of the donor's wealth, and the importance of giving secretly, basically combine to really hide the presence of the recipient in basically what is the zakat transaction, or at least pull the spotlight away from the recipient onto the donor. And this, and if you the way zakat was taught in the madrasa as well imply this. So even when people that are poor are addressed by scriptures, they're often addressed not as recipients, as in what should we do when we get zakat, but as donors. For instance, there's the well-known hadith that even if you can give nothing else, give half of a date in charity to save yourself from the hellfire. And there's many other hadiths like this. I won't waste your time. As opposed to really only the only scriptural reference I came across this in the course of ordinary Muslim discussions on this for recipients was if you if you pretend to be a needy recipient and you take charity, then this is in fact slander against Allah. So suggesting that this is how you speak. This is the only instance of I found of scripture speaking to Muslims as zakat recipients as opposed to donors. But in contrast to this, we saw something very different happening in the charity associations. So the first reaction could be, well, they're moving away from the Sharia. They don't understand this fiqh and its teachings. They're becoming westernized and modernized. Max Weber would say charity is becoming routinized into organizations. And you can make that argument. I'm sure people have. But I want to look at what I'm calling the developmentalist ethic and some aspects of the charity organizations who follow and are animated by a developmentalist ethic, and how closely these I see are actually linked to the sources of the law, Quran, Sunnah, and fiqh, or how they're expressed in fiqh. So what I call the developmentalist ethic in my paper. Try and move faster. Wait, I have like 5 minutes.
Oh no, you got like.
Oh, I do have one.
Yeah, you got more than 50.
Oh, fantastic. Oh, jeez. Okay, great. So I think I will try and recover as best I can. It shouldn't be too bad. So in the opening of Indiana, I described an Islamic Charities organization distribution event. Obviously, the charity organizations are a little bit more concerned with a macroeconomic perspective of alleviating poverty, using the zakat as a means for socioeconomic development. This is incredibly important in India these days. A recent government report in 2006, the Secretary Committee report, came out that statistically, with sort of reams of statistical data, directly compared with the Muslim community in India to the former untouchable community in India, as in the low caste. So, which not only was interesting for reasons of policy making and how well the Indian government, which of course is the world's largest democracy and deals with an incredible diversity within its own society, it has policy implications, but also like intense socio-cultural implications for the Muslim community to be compared so explicitly with what's historically been India's most backward, as they say, in India, community. And particularly in Lucknow, which is historically the home of some of India's most elite literati, you got the impression that there was an acute sense of anxiety over the socioeconomic backwardness or lack of development among the Muslim community. So without going into detail, that's the socio-political framework we're talking about, that where these charity organizations are cropping up, especially since the 1990s. And one aspect of so what are these organizations doing? Muslim almgivers, Muslim charities and donors of a more developmentalist mindset are animated by a set of moral concerns that, like I said, are more focused on the recipient, actually, than the donor of zakat. Who this recipient is. Are they truly needy? What do they write on their application form? Why are they in poverty or in need, and how can we best alleviate this poverty, such as analyzing the causal conditions of their neediness, and attention to systematizing zakat collection and distribution a little bit more, and then even paying attention to the life of zakat after it's given. So after it comes into the hands of the zakat recipients, what are they doing with it? How are they spending it? And are they utilizing it effectively? These are all questions that I heard ad nauseum when I was volunteering and working in these zakat charity associations. Actually, interestingly, I wanted to make a point about the purity ethic and the idea that in the Quran that we should hide charity because it's damaging on the recipient has an exact parallel with the social theory of Marcel Mauss, Emile Durkheim's most famous student, in his book The Gift, the idea that charity can be damaging upon the recipient, and that something that it establishes a hierarchical relationship, correct? Because by displaying wealth and giving money to a poor person, you're necessarily showing that yourself as having more resources than they do. So a criticism that I did hear occasionally of the organizations is that this is what they're doing. They're shaming recipients if they ever ask for an application form or give in public or monitor what recipients do with those gifts. So Maulana Jahangir Qasmi, this Deobandi educated, he's an alim. He's at the head of the charity that I introduced in the first vignette, the Anjuman-e Falaih, the Society for Divine Welfare. He's not the only member of the ulema that has a charity organization, but he's one of the most distinguished, and he's a great example for what I'm trying to say. He has a lot of respect, not only in the community that he works in, but also among the ulema, and he was actually referred to me when I first went to the madrasa Nadwatu Ulama, and people in scholarly circles are just as aware of him as Papi. He's not necessarily just a street preacher, is what I'm trying to say, but he does have a great degree, he commands a great degree of respect in the community of Old Lucknow that he works in. He's also a hakim, like a herbal doctor. People come to him for advice, also what to name their baby. Hindus come to him for advice also. His reputation has sort of grown to that degree. And before he started this charity, he taught at a madrasa in the largest madrasa in the same neighborhood as Farangi Mahal, so the historical madrasa that Francis Robinson writes about. That's probably Lucknow's most famous. He's also a Hafiz al-Quran. His scholarship is, his madrasa education and credentials are indisputable in that way. And he's 50 now, but he came to Lucknow from Deoband about 30 years ago. Great. When I asked him why he did what he did, he recited a hadith for me. After faith, the next obligation, fard, is earning income in a halal way. And then gave his own explanation of this. So don't you see, Chris, the purpose of zakat is for the poor to stand up on their own. Otherwise, some of them will go to hell. And he's very concerned with how recipients of zakat utilize the zakat that he's giving them, because he sees the necessity to earn a halal income as a fard, and also he sees fiqh as relatively silent on the question of what recipients of zakat are supposed to do with that. So he combines teachings on zakat with other teachings on work ethic and some of the things that Moiz was discussing yesterday in his paper. And you can see this in what he's giving, right? So each of his zakat gifts although the sewing machines and the vegetable carts were accompanied with cash so that people can be starting their own businesses and having liquid resources, they're also instruments of employment. He expected that the women would go and use the sewing machines to become seamstresses, and the men would use the vegetable carts to go become, small-time entrepreneurs. He inscribed each vegetable cart and sewing machine with the name of his Society for Divine Welfare written in cursive Urdu, and he had an extensive sermon at this charity distribution event about how warning recipients from going into the bazaar and selling these items just to get cash, which is of course very easy because it's the bazaar. And he even emphasized that each sewing machine in each cart was built by a local craftsperson and comes with a warranty, guarantee is what he said, and you can take it back to that shop even if it breaks, you don't have to sell it, and he will repair it for you and you can keep using it. He just, every aspect of the sermon he gave at this distribution event emphasized that these are to be used as means to self-employment. And so I also said to him, Maulana Jahangir, you know that zakat is the haqq of the recipients. You can't tell them what to do with it and how to spend it. And he said, of course I know that, and he even said that in his sermon, even though this is your right. You're standing here in front of Allah, and I'm saying this to you in front of Allah. Would you, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can see what you do with this zakat that we're giving you, and would you waste them? Or will you do what I say? So he's towing a close line of sticking to what the teachings of fiqh as they are the right of the recipient, but using the full weight of his moral authority to encourage that these be used for self-employment. And then lastly, the contentious issue is, of course, the public institutionalization of this, right? So the recording the names of recipients in application forms and monitoring them, potentially following up. I discussed this with Maulana Jahangir. Each of these issues that I'm representing, I also discussed with the Mufti at the Madrasa, Nadwatul Ulama, but I won't go into what he said if we can in comments. But both the Mufti at Nadwa and Maulana Jahangir reminded me that the Quranic verse is not only the hadith is give from your right hand so your left hand doesn't see, but the Quranic verse is it's best if you give in secret, but if you give in public, that's also good. Al-Ghazali's interpretation, as well as many other scholars, is that giving zakat in public is good, can even be recommended in the condition that it encourages other Muslims to also keep the obligation of zakat. And that's precisely what Maulana Jahangir imagined he was doing. He invited, in this case, 12 donors to come witness the distribution of their zakat because these businessmen in this bazaar are very concerned about corruption and are very concerned about the development of the Muslim community. And the implication being that they might not be giving their zakat or they might not be giving their zakat as effectively if they weren't able to see it with their own eyes. I also interviewed many people, the vast majority of people that gave to this charity who didn't go to these distributions and they didn't like to as donors. So I will just clarify that I'm not saying that all Indian zakat givers want to be photographed and put in the paper and get public recognitions. Most of them don't, but for the doubters, there is this public forum and this public institutionalization and this charity that is making public headlines, which the Maulana intended to be public. So I guess I just want to take a couple moments to say how I think my research is relevant to some of the discussions we've been having that I didn't really develop in my other work and paper. When we're thinking about, I think the practice and teachings on zakat are actually particularly instructive reminders of the internal diversity of the Sharia that has come up a couple times, and how looking at sort of a divine command orientation towards ethics, and that this taqleed orientation is often insufficient even within the confines of fiqh as it's traditionally been imagined. And you can see this in the sense that zakat is both ibadat and muamalat. There's a dichotomous sort of almost contradiction at times contained within the very fiqhy curriculum that madrasa students are taught, as in they learn zakat once and then again in a different context. And then and I'm just trying to draw that same internal contradiction and dualism out when I elaborate the two sides of zakat into what I'm calling the purity ethic and the developmentalist ethic. And also, the final point is that Mufti Atiq and the ulama Maulana Jahangir look at how they're remaining relevant in contemporary times, which is something that we've been even forgetting in this discussion this week. So ulama and the students and teachers of fiqh are not necessarily just concerned with taqleed and sticking within the confines of their madhab. They're very creative in balancing different moral criterion within the fiqhi tradition and applying them in different ways, and are at the forefront of some of these changes. So the Maulana Jahangir was leading the charity organization that I worked with, and it had the approval of Nadwa and many of the other ulama. This wasn't seen as some westernization or Westoxification. These changes in zakat in more developmentalist ways were encouraged. Also, why do I keep saying that zakat and charity practices are changing? Wasn't zakat always imagined as a social welfare by the Prophet? Yes, in a way, but if you look at the historical literature, if you look, it's great scholarship we do have on Islamic history, particularly on al-Qaf and Waqf. Saeed Amir Arjumand, in his article, Public Policy in Islam or something, has a great quote where he calls out that it's surprising that the Quranic notion of zakat and sadaqah, as in the notions from the Quran, did not become the legal basis for philanthropy in the Muslim world. Waqf did, and Waqf is a concept and a legal notion that arose more in medieval times. It is based on one hadith of, I think it's Hazrat Umar alayhi salam, who put aside a landed endowment, but it, for the most part, was a legal discourse that got articulated much later after the time of the Prophet. And why I think the ulama are so creative is they're actually returning from a medieval emphasis on waqf and charitable giving by the elite, by landowners in landed endowments, by courtly elites, and returning to a notion of zakat that originates in the Quran, that reminds Muslims of their individual obligation. And yeah, thanks very much.
Thank you.